Hello everyone, and thank you in advance for your attention. I am Stefano Caselli, PhD student at the University of Malta, and this presentation constitutes a brief excerpt from my ongoing research on memory in digital games. By using the example of Fire Emblem Three Houses, I will suggest how the idea of memory could prove useful to enrich our take on how we can deal with the past through games, or more generally on how games inherently deal with the past. To begin with, and before introducing something I may provisionally term a memory perspective for digital games, an at least concise preamble to the matter in hand is needed. In dealing with digital games that engage with the past, it is almost inevitable to step into the academic field of historical game studies, which, following Chapman, is interested in how games deal with the past in some broad way. Here, what is of interest for me is that despite of the fact that the field discusses a varied range of concepts, ideas and definitions, there is nothing like an ontological definition of historical games. As a matter of fact, the field is increasingly opening to broader approaches that in some way extend the borders of how game can provide historical knowledge. I find productive to align with Chapman's definition of historical games as systems for historing of that purpose. From both the designers, players, and broader audiences as well, games can serve as systems for historing and make claims about the past in various ways. By using this definition, we can of course understand how the Oregon Trail could easily become a system for historing. It has an explicitly stated historical setting, it clearly provides claims about the past, and it provides players with mimetic textual visual realism that eventually affords a relatively reliable representation of the past and simulation of historicized processes as well. Similarly, we can discuss about Assassin's Creed historicity. The game of course features unhistorical science fiction elements, as well as historical inaccuracies or inconsistencies, but even without being a sort of documentary game, such as the previous example, it nonetheless makes claims about the past, has a stated historical setting, and is aimed at providing a relatively accurate simulation of the period it is based on. So, as a consequence, we can still easily claim that Assassin's Creed is a system for historing. A third example is much more problematic from the perspective of historical game studies. In the life simulation strategy game Spore, players control and develop their own species from prehistoric societies to interstellar exploration. Differently from other games that take into account human beings and the evolution of mankind through ages, Spore is set in a randomly generated universe and features randomly generated creatures, fantasy buildings, and so on. Despite it clearly simulates and represents something that projects a specific idea of evolution, culturally mediated of course, Spore deals with a universe and a past that never existed and that are entirely fictional. Spore can still be used as a system for historing, but in dealing with Spore, historical game studies run the risk of making everything historical, therefore transforming claims on popular history and narrativization into umbrella claims that make sense everywhere and therefore anywhere. My suggestion is then to use memory to look at how digital games deal with the past beyond historicity. These imply looking at memory studies as a companion for history and historical theory, and to shift our approach to the past from the past itself to present modes of remembering it. While history and historiography acknowledge the narrativization of whole histories and the contingency of the past, they are still interested in the what of what happened back then and oriented towards processes of or facts or evidences and so on. On the other hand, memory studies are not interested in truths about history, but rather focus on present modes of remembering. By speaking of memory, the focus shifts from the what of what happened back then to the how in how we are remembering, reimagining a certain past state of things. This leads to a different focus on digital games as well. Digital games, as a memory-making medium among others, constitute memory sites and technologically provide access to different forms of remembering. If systems for historing could be analyzed as history play spaces, I will suggest to look at them as memory play spaces. Here I use the term space to refer to memory studies debates, but of course I would not mean to reinforce some kind of space bias for digital games. History play spaces are therefore a subset of memory play spaces, being that basically every digital game can be intended as a memory play space. This regardless of settings and themes. The memory perspective makes much easier to look at games such as Spore. Memory-making potential emerges from both pseudo-historical fantasy games and from sci-fi post-apocalyptic games. Here we have one example for each of these settings. Same goes for the ludological aspects of games, which afford memory making regardless their genre, mechanics, and gameplay. Here I tried again to provide two quite different examples for that. On this basis, in the rest of the presentation I will provide a first overview of Fire Emblem Three Houses from the memory perspective. I will use memory as a theoretical tool to reread historical game studies frameworks or concepts, and at the same time I wish I'll provide an interesting look at how even unhistorical games can look at the past in various ways, making players perform memory within a multifaceted memory play space. Of course, Three Houses may not be the most unhistorical game among others. The reason of my choice is due to the fact that it's quite filled with memory-making potentials, and it therefore provides a lot of examples to look at. I also enjoyed the game quite a lot, to be honest, and that's why I chose it for this presentation. Just like the previous games of the series, Three Houses is a tactical role-playing game with social simulation elements. It is set in the continent of Fodlan, divided into three rival nations and with at the center the Garek Mach monastery, ruled by the Church of Cyrus. The events cover a period of 5 years, from Imperial year 1180 to 1185. Despite there's no trace of historical events, it is evident that the game takes place in a medieval setting, full of churches, castles, knights, and so on and so forth. It would be hard to claim that such a setting provides specific knowledge about history. Rather, the memory play space of Three Houses lies at the intersection of several memory brands. The most prominent of these is maybe the brand Middle Ages, built upon selective authenticity. Instead of being historically or geographically accurate, the game is evocative of the brand and the feel of the Middle Ages. Such a brand is constructed through recognizable places such as the church, the ruin, the castle, and how these places are depicted or explored by player is reminiscent of different media forms. When a player explores the Garek Mach monastery, for example, at the same time it is exploring a medieval setting and something that reminds of Harry Potter's Hogwarts. Memory brands are influenced and shaped by actual historical evidences, but most importantly by topoia and cliches, conventions, imaginaries, and so on. The Middle Ages of Three Houses is influenced by power fantasy, for example, historical movies, and recent popular branded iterations such as Game of Thrones, as well as by popular culture of Japan. At the same time, memory brands are bound to nostalgia and fetishization of the past. By reenacting the feeling of imprecise yet heroic pasts, players step into a playground that, according to Baudrillard, resurrects the period when at least there was history, at least there was violence, and at least life and death were at stake. The concept of mnemonic iconization, for example, helps us analyzing the circulation of mnemonic icons across different media. Here we can see how the godlike transformation of the hero, for example, is iconized and reused towards different media frameworks and carries specific cultural biases or meanings accordingly. The ideas of pre and remediation, often discussed in media memory studies, provide us with the theoretical tools to grasp the complexity of memory play spaces intended as a referential playgrounds. Mnemonic icons get remediated by other media forms and merge together to form a referential space that favors different memory performances. The Evil Goddess, the False God, the English Boarding School, Three Houses provides players with a playground that's influenced and shaped by different icons, biases, ideologies, and of course filtered through different media and cliches. Differently from other games, Three Houses also shares with pseudo-historical games the capacity to make more or less explicit claims about the very way in which we engage with the past, both collectively and individually. Meta-memory narrative representations or gameplay simulations are influenced by memory branding too, and of course they resemble at the same time both power fantasy topoi or medieval popular cliches. Not only the main character suffers from amnesia, but most importantly the whole Fodlan can only rely on repositories of memory to achieve an at least convincing view of its own past. The most notable implications of the game's narrative revolve precisely around this lack of ultimate truth about the past, and therefore around the difficulty of remembering. Individual and collective level then become two facets of the same medal. Three Houses explicitly discusses how memory means not only how we look at the past, but how we construct our present identities and therefore shape our own future. False deities, merciless monarchs, and desperate knights play with memory. They all play with memory to get what they want from Fodlan. Let's draw some conclusions from this. Memory play spaces deal with a past that becomes timeless. Three Houses discloses temporal coexistencies and makes them accessible to players. Different multiple temporalities coexist within such playground, and therefore history, intended as a series of facts or processes, simply cease to exist within them. We may say that memory play spaces imagine the past by superimposing a present onto it, their present onto it, regardless of chronology. Memory play spaces, memory-making potentials, favor memory performances both by players and designers. By dealing with memory performances, memory studies could prove fruitful to understand how games that engage with the past represent it and make it accessible as a vulnerable, fragmented, and merged referential playground. As arts memoriae, every digital game provides players with the chance to play with their own memory, both individually and collectively. At the same time, by speaking of memory within digital games, we can look at the socio-cultural situatedness of our remembering, and focus on ideologies as well as on cultural biases or schemata of remembering. Of course, this is just a first overview on an inclusive framework for memory in digital games, and I should reference to further investigations and future developments of this matter, as well as to already existing similar attempts, such as those you find in the following reference list. Following reference list that is quite long, I have to admit it, but I think you can stop the video and read carefully in case of need. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention again, and here you find my mail, and of course see you at the Q&A session. Thank you.